Horror Stories channel. Now, I'm going to tell you a spooky hurricane story about Hurricane Katrina, one of the most devastating and deadliest hurricanes in U.S. history, which began to form on August 23, 2005. Turn off the lights, crawl under the blankets, and get ready to listen. Let's get started. Chapter 1, The Calm Before the Storm. August 24, 2005, Miami-Dade County, Florida. I remember the heat that day. It wasn't the usual sticky Florida heat. It was heavier, like the air itself was warning us. The sky had this eerie gray tint, as if the sun had given up trying to shine through the thick clouds. The news had been talking about Hurricane Katrina all day, saying it was heading straight for us. But in Miami, hurricanes were just part of life. We'd been through warnings before most of the time. They just passed us by. My dad was outside, boarding up the windows. The sharp thud of the hammer hitting the plywood echoed through the house. Mom was packing emergency supplies, flashlights, bottled water, canned food. The radio played in the background, broadcasting updates from the National Hurricane Center. Words like Category 1, storm surge, and evacuation zones were repeated over and over. I was 14 at the time, old enough to understand what a hurricane could do, but still young enough to think it wouldn't really be that bad. My younger brother, Jason, didn't get it at all. He thought the storm was exciting, like some big adventure. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Trees bent just slightly, like they were whispering to each other. The sky turned a sickly greenish gray. That's when I felt this tightness in my chest, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Dad came inside, his face tense. "We're heading to the basement," he said. "But it's just starting," I replied, glancing out the window at the swaying palm trees. "That's exactly why we're going now," he shot back, his voice sharper than usual. We grabbed our bags and made our way to the basement, a cramped, musty space that smelled like damp concrete. Dad secured the door behind us, blocking out the world above. The radio kept going, its voice crackling with static as the storm grew closer. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. The walls trembled with each gust, and the house creaked as if it were breathing. I sat there, flashlight in hand, trying to ignore the growing fear in my chest. Then the power went out. We were left in complete darkness, except for the dim beam of my flashlight. That's when it really hit me this wasn't just another storm. Katrina was different, and it had only just begun. Chapter 2, The Storm Hits. The sound was the first thing that got to me. It wasn't just a wind, it was a roar. Like a freight train barreling straight at us, never slowing down. The basement walls vibrated with each gust, and dust fell from the ceiling like the house was shaking itself apart. Dad kept checking the small, narrow window near the ceiling. All I could see through it was darkness, broken occasionally by flashes of lightning that lit up twisted shadows of trees being ripped apart. The rain didn't fall straight down, it was sideways, like sharp knives slashing against the house. Jason clung to Mom, his little hands gripping her tightly. He wasn't pretending it was fun anymore. His wide eyes reflected every creak, every bang from above. Wanted to be brave for him, but my heart was racing, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The radio crackled with static, the announcer's voice fading in and out. Hurricane Katrina has made landfall. Sustained winds over 80 miles per hour. Stay indoors. Avoid windows. Then there was a loud crack like the sky itself had split open. The entire house shuddered. I heard something massive crash outside, maybe a tree or part of the roof. Mom gasped and covered Jason's ears. Dad just stared at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. Water started seeping through the basement walls. First, it was just small puddles forming around the edges, but within minutes, it was spreading across the floor. The damp, cold water soaked into my sneakers, making everything feel more real, more dangerous. "We need to move," Dad said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it that made my stomach twist. "Where?" Mom whispered, holding Jason close. Dad didn't answer. He just opened the basement door. A rush of cold, wet air hit us like a slap. The hallway upstairs was dark, except for the faint, flickering glow from lightning outside. The house groaned under the pressure of the storm, like it was fighting to stay standing. We stepped into the hallway, our flashlights casting shaky beams on the walls. The air smelled like wet wood, mixed with something metallic, maybe from broken pipes. I could hear water dripping somewhere, steady and rhythmic. like a ticking clock counting down to something worse. Then we heard it. Bang! Something or someone was pounding on the front door. We all froze. Dad motioned for us to stay back. He crept toward the door, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "Hello," he called out, his voice almost drowned by the storm outside. No answer, just another loud bang. Harder this time, like whoever or whatever was out there was desperate. Dad hesitated for a second, then slowly reached for the door handle. "Don't," Mom whispered, her voice trembling. But he opened it anyway. The door flew open with the wind slamming against the wall. Rain and debris rushed in, soaking the floor instantly. Dad shined his flashlight outside. No one was there, just the storm. Or so we thought. Chapter 3, Trapped. Dad slammed the door shut, his face pale and tense. He locked it quickly, sliding the deadbolt into place, as if that thin piece of metal could hold back the chaos outside. The wind howled even louder now, rattling the walls like the house itself was trying to shake us out. "What was that?" Mom whispered, clutching Jason so tightly he winced. Dad didn't answer. He just shook his head and backed away from the door, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the room. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The house groaned again, louder this time. I could hear parts of the roof peeling away, like the storm was trying to rip the entire building apart, one piece at a time. Water was pouring in from under the door now, mixing with the puddles that had already formed on the floor. The power had been out for hours, and without the hum of electricity, every sound felt sharper, every creak, every gust, every drop of water. Dad led us back toward the basement, but when we reached the stairs, we stopped cold. Water. The basement was flooding, fast. The steps were already submerged halfway, dark water reflecting our flashlight beams like black glass. The damp, earthy smell had turned sour, mixed with the stench of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust or blood. "We can't stay here," Dad muttered, his voice low but urgent. "Where do we go?" Mom's voice was tight, filled with fear she was trying hard to hide. Dad didn't answer right away. Then he looked up toward the attic. Without another word, we scrambled upstairs. The house felt like it could collapse any minute, each step groaning under our weight. When we reached the attic door, Dad yanked it open, and we climbed into the cramped, dusty space. It was hot and suffocating, the air thick and stale. The only light came from small gaps in the wooden slats, where wind and rain forced their way in. We could hear the storm screaming outside, battering the house with relentless fury. Jason started to cry softly, his small body shaking as he buried his face into Mom's side. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight like the storm wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me too. Time felt strange up there. Minutes stretched into hours. The storm raged on, shaking the house like a giant was trying to tear it apart with his bare hands. Then just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, there was a loud crash. The roof had been partially torn away. Rain poured in, soaking us instantly. The wind howled through the opening, cold and violent. Debris flew in shards of wood, pieces of insulation, even small branches. Dad tried to shield us, but there was nowhere to hide. And that's when I realized we weren't just fighting the storm anymore. We were fighting to survive. Chapter 4, The Aftermath. When I woke up, everything was quiet. Not the comforting kind of quiet, like when the rain finally stops after a summer storm. This was different, heavy, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring because there's nothing left to hear. I was lying in the attic, soaked to the bone, my head resting against a piece of broken wood. The air smelled like wet insulation, mildew, and something sharp like metal or dirt. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or why everything felt so wrong. Then it hit me, Katrina, the storm. I sat up fast, my heart racing. Roof above us was mostly gone, jagged wooden beams sticking out like broken ribs. The morning light poured in gray and weak through the thick clouds. Rain was still falling, but it was softer now, a light drizzle compared to the fury from before. "Mom, Dad," my voice came out hoarse, cracking as I spoke. My unstirred first curled up beside Jason, who was still asleep, his face pale but breathing. Relief flooded through me so fast I almost cried. Dad was slumped against the wall, his eyes open but distant, staring at nothing. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood from a small cut on his forehead. "We're okay," he whispered like he was trying to convince himself. But we weren't. The attic was a mess, broken boards, shattered glass, and puddles of dirty water everywhere. The storm had ripped through like it owned the place, leaving behind only wreckage. We had to get out. Dad helped Mom to her feet, then gently lifted Jason, who whimpered softly but didn't wake up fully. We made our way downstairs, or what was left of it. The staircase creaked dangerously with every step, and parts of the floor had caved in, exposing the dark, flooded basement below. And we finally reached the front door. Dad paused, his hand on the handle. We all stood there for a second, too scared to open it. What if the outside was worse than what we'd already seen? But we had no choice. Dad pushed the door open. I'll never forget what I saw. Our neighborhood was gone. Houses flattened, trees uprooted like weeds, cars flipped over like toys. The streets were rivers now, filled with muddy water and debris. Pieces of people's lives floated past photo albums. Furniture, a child's stuffed bear drifting aimlessly. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds that still threatened more rain. The wind had died down, but the damage was already done. We stepped outside, our shoes sinking into the muddy ground. It was like walking through a nightmare, only this was real. The silence was deafening, broken only by distant cries and the faint sound of helicopters somewhere far away. We weren't alone. Neighbors slowly emerged from what was left of their homes, faces blank, clothes torn, eyes wide with shock. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. We were all thinking the same thing. What do we do now? Dad tightened his grip on Jason and looked around, searching for anything, a sign, a rescue crew, some kind of hope. But all we saw was destruction. That's when we heard it, a faint voice calling for help. It was coming from the house across the street, what was left of it anyway. Without hesitating, Dad handed Jason to Mom and ran toward the voice. I followed, my legs shaking with every step. The house was half collapsed, but the voice was clear now, a woman trapped under the debris. Dad started pulling at the wreckage, his hands bleeding from the splintered wood and jagged metal. I tried to help, even though my arms felt weak and useless. We worked until our fingers were raw, until my lungs burned from exhaustion. And finally, we found her, a neighbor we barely knew, her face covered in dirt and tears, but alive. Dad pulled her out and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. In that moment, something changed. The fear was still there. The loss was still overwhelming. But we weren't just survivors anymore. We were the ones who helped, and somehow that made all the difference. Chapter 5, Picking Up the Pieces. Days passed, though it was hard to keep track of time. Without power, phones, or clocks, the hours bled together in a blur of gray skies, muddy water, and exhaustion. The sun would rise, casting its weak light over a world that no longer felt like home, and then it would set, leaving us in darkness once again. First rescue teams arrived 2 days after the storm. Helicopters hovered overhead, their blades slicing through the thick, humid air. Boats navigated the flooded streets, carrying people to makeshift shelters set up in schools and stadiums. We didn't have much to take with us, just the clothes on our backs, a small bag Dad had managed to grab before the storm hit, and each other. That's what mattered most. When we reached the shelter, it was overwhelming. Hundreds of people crammed into a large gymnasium, their faces hollow with shock. Some were injured, some were crying, and others just stared blankly at the walls, lost in their own grief. But there was also something else, something I hadn't expected. Hope. Strangers helping strangers. Volunteers handing out food and water. Comforting words exchanged between people who'd never met before. Kids sharing toys they'd managed to save. Even if it was just a battered action figure or a torn-up book. We found a corner to sit in, huddled together on thin blankets spread across the cold floor. Jason clung to Mom, his small body finally giving in to exhaustion. Dad sat beside them, his arm wrapped protectively around us. I just stared at the ceiling, thinking about everything we'd lost and everything we still had. It wasn't easy after that. The days turned into weeks, and every day was a battle. Cleaning up the wreckage, searching for missing neighbors, trying to find a sense of normal in a world that felt anything but. But we kept going, because that's what people do. I remember walking through what was left of our neighborhood weeks later. The houses were gone, but the people weren't. They were there, rebuilding, hammering, lifting, clearing debris, laughing even. It was strange hearing laughter in a place that had seen so much pain. But that's when I realized something important. Katrina took a lot from us us our home, our safety, our sense of control. But it couldn't take everything. It couldn't take who we were. It couldn't take our strength, our kindness, or the way we held on to each other when it felt like the world was falling apart. I thought about that night in the attic when I was sure we wouldn't make it, when the storm was louder than my own thoughts, and fear felt like it would swallow me whole. But we did make it. We survived, and sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do.